Hello. We're going to do the next part of the home group 1 Corinthians little talks that hopefully will help you in your discussion. And today we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 6 verses 1 to 11. So do have a look at that now if you want to, if you haven't already. And today, as I record, I think the twins are next door, tidying their bedroom, and Granny is downstairs watching the telly at a loud volume. So who knows whether you'll be distracted by any of that, but I'm sure it will be of great entertainment value if you are. Anyway, let's get into chapter 6. So as we said last time, from chapter 5 of 1 Corinthians, Paul seems to be dealing with specific issues that have been brought to his attention, problems in the church. And we find that again in chapter 6. And particularly in this chapter, he's talking about what happens when people have disputes with one another in the church. And I suppose underlying everything that he's saying in this chapter is this ongoing plea that we see all through the letter for unity and harmony, which really would remove the need for any of this. But anyway, the big issue here is that the Christians in Corinth are not only falling out with each other, but they're even taking the disputes that they have with one another to pagans, to people outside of the church, to be adjudicated. And so that, from Paul's perspective, is a huge problem. Let's have a little think about why it's such a problem for Paul that they're taking these disputes out into the world rather than being dealt with in the church. First of all, Paul's argument is that the destiny of the children of God is to join with Christ in the judging of the world. So when the end times come, if you like, when Jesus returns, Jesus's people, his brothers and sisters, will be with him judging the world. That is our eschatological destiny. And so Paul says it's completely absurd that these Christians who are going to be judging the world are actually looking for the world to judge between them, that they're taking one another to pagan law courts. And surely, Paul says, they should be seeking God's wisdom for sorting these disputes out between each other and among themselves. And in fact, Paul sort of points out the irony here that apparently they are very wise people, these Corinthian Christians, and yet there is nobody amongst them who is wise enough to deal with these disputes. So there's that sense in which these Christians are not recognizing who they really are. They're not realizing they're going to be judging the world, and they're going to the world to judge between them. Perhaps a second thing to mention is that it's worth noting that in the Roman law courts, there was a strong bias in favor of the rich and against the poor. So it's probably quite likely that in these disputes that these Christians are taking to the law courts, the rich Christians are taking their poor brothers and sisters to court to ride roughshod over their needs or demands. So it could quite likely be a reflection of the inequality that was there in the church, and of the fact that the rich wanted to exert their power and authority over the poor. And probably we see the same thing in chapter 11 when we get to that. Seems to have been a problem in Corinth, and therefore Paul says that this action is shameful, probably partly at least because it was that sense of some members, rich members, wanting to keep the poor members down in their downtrodden place. But I think probably above all, and in agreement with the theme of the letter, the reason why Paul finds this situation so disgraceful is that he says in verse 6, it pits brother against brother. That there's something about this taking these disputes to court and going one against another that is just so in contradiction with the gospel and with the community that these Christians are supposed to be a part of. So these really are family arguments between brothers and sisters in God's family, in God's community. And yet, rather than being sorted out as family disputes, they're being taken out into the world, into the place of the unrighteous, and they're asking the people in the world to try and sort them out. They're being brought out into the public arena. And by doing so, they're really bringing the church into disrepute. And there's a little quote I'd like to read, but I've left it over there, so I'll just go and get the book. So this excellent book by Richard Hayes, commentary on 1 Corinthians, he says this. He says, let the point be registered clearly. In 1 Corinthians 6, 1 to 11, which we're looking at today, Paul hasn't really changed the subject from the topic of chapter 5. So although he's talking about an issue of sexual immorality in chapter 5, and now he's talking about sort of legal disputes, probably about economic issues, he says in both cases, the problem is, quoting Gordon Fee, a failure of the church to be the church. That is the fundamental issue of these two chapters of the letter. He's summoning his Corinthian readers to a conversion of the imagination, calling them to understand themselves first and foremost as the saints, that is, the eschatological people of God, called out of their previous social world. That means they're now bound together as a people in a way that requires them to modify their former ways of life. So Paul is saying, you're no longer living in the world in the way that you did before. You need to think critically about the way the world does things like dealing with disputes. You need to think of yourselves now as the saints, as God's people, and work out how should you live together in that new reality. So I think the question here is, what is of highest importance? Paul makes it clear in these verses that the unity of the church and the sharing of the beautiful message of the gospel is the crucial thing. So by taking one another to court, there are no winners. Even those who win their case damage the communication of the gospel, damage the reputation of the church. And simply embarking on these lawsuits, he says in verse 7, is a defeat for everyone. Because these people are not living cross-shaped lives. And if they were, then surely, as Paul says in verse 7, they would sooner be wronged and cheated than to harm one another and to harm the church. A really interesting and, topsy-turvy way of looking at things. And then what Paul says in verse 9 to 11 at the end of these verses today, I don't think he's speaking that as a threat. You're doing these things and therefore you will not inherit the kingdom. I think he's reminding again this community, this church, of who they really are. It's a challenge to these Christians in Corinth that they're not living according to their true identity. They're not living as people who have been washed, purified, sanctified, made holy, justified, made right with God. They're not living as those people who they really are. And Paul compares this shameful situation of taking one another to court with other examples of how Christians can't simply go on living like the world, like the society they used to be part of, because they've been fundamentally transformed by Christ. And so their lives must now reflect the fact that that transformation has taken place. Now, next week, in the second half of chapter 6, we will be looking a bit at sexual sin and sexual morality and what Paul writes about that. So we're not going to look at that here, but it's good to notice the breadth of what Paul mentions in verses 9, 10, 11 as being anathema to living as the saints of God. The kinds of things that we simply can't do if we're going to be living in our identity as Christians. And maybe especially as those who live in the rich West, we need to take special note of greed. those who are greedy will not be inheritors of the kingdom. What does that have to say to us? I'm going to share some questions on the screen that you might want to now consider together as a group, because there's plenty for us to talk about and perhaps to be challenged by in this half a chapter. So I'll share my screen now. And hopefully you can see them. Sorry, quite a lot of writing there. But if you pause the screen and have a little think about those together.